Okay, but tonight we are ending the 10 precepts. So we did the first 5 precepts, and then the second half of the 10 Bodhisattva precepts are specific to Mahayana Buddhism. And tonight we are doing the one that is called not disparaging the 3 treasures. Not disparaging the 3 treasures. So I'll tell you, I was sitting out earlier on my deck and thinking, does that mean we can't criticize teachings? We can't have judgment about communities? I certainly have visited communities where I haven't felt a resonance, or where I felt like things aren't happening in a safe way or in a skillful way. Um, and so I kind of bristled a little bit at not having constructive criticism. Now, it's hard to see how we would do this with the Buddha, right? Maybe it isn't. But what does this precept mean? It comes at the end. These are the 10 great precepts, quote unquote. So I'd love to share with you some thoughts that I had about kind of a way perhaps to think about what these are. Now, if you're not familiar with the triple gem or the 3 jewels of Buddhism, the chant that I just played was the Pali chant, Buddham Saranam Gacchami, which is I take refuge in the Buddha. Dharmam Saranam Gacchami, which is I take refuge in the Dharma or in the teachings of the Buddha. And then Sangham Saranam Gacchami, I take refuge in the community, the spiritual community or the meditation community. And so in that chant, there is a clue here, and the word is refuge. This is called the refuge chant, since we began by talking a bit about refuge. And I think what I really love about this passage is he is really sort of expressing just the precious nature of refuge, of the 3 refuges, what they really ultimately mean for us. So this is the refuge chant. Incense perfumes the atmosphere. A lotus blooms, and the Buddha appears. The world of suffering and discrimination is filled with the light of the rising sun. And as the dust of fear and anxiety settles, with open heart, one pointed mind, I turn to the 3 jewels. The fully enlightened one, beautifully seated, peaceful, and content, a living source of understanding and compassion. To the Buddha, I go for refuge. The path of mindful living, leading to healing, joy, and enlightenment, the way of peace. To the Dharma, I go for refuge. The loving and supportive community of practice, realizing harmony, awareness, and liberation. To the Sangha, I go for refuge. I am aware that the 3 gems are there within my heart. I vow to realize them, practicing mindful breathing and contentment, looking deeply into things. I vow to understand living beings and their suffering, to cultivate compassion and loving kindness, and to practice joy and equanimity. I vow to offer joy to one person in the morning, to help relieve the grief of one person in the afternoon, living simply and sanely with few possessions, keeping my body healthy. I vow to let go of all that worries me and all anxiety, in order to be light and free. I am aware that I owe so much to my parents, teachers, friends, and all beings. I vow to be worthy of their trust, to practice wholeheartedly, so that understanding and compassion will flower, helping living beings be free from their suffering. Thus, may the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha support all these efforts. That man had a way with words. What a beautiful, beautiful passage, I think. So this 10th Bodhisattva Precept, do not disparage the triple gem or encourage others to do so. Or, as my friend John Bales, who is a Zen priest, I mentioned, I believe last time, that in the ordination ceremony of my other friend, Bob Cox, who is now Sosei Jendo, a priest as a Zen priest, and as part of the ceremony in the program, he had Sosei do all the 10 precepts, basically reciting the 10 precepts of the Bodhisattva. And I remarked last time how, interestingly, they aren't, in the Zen tradition, they aren't expressed in such a way that they are sort of putting forth the negative aspect first, such as don't disparage the triple gem, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. But rather, they accentuate the wholesome qualities, the points of cultivation. So, for example, I'm going to read through these again in the way that they had them listed on the program. So if you heard these last week, bear with me here. But each of the Bodhisattva precepts, the disciple of Buddha protects life, does not kill. First precept. Second, a disciple of Buddha gives gifts, does not steal. So generosity, yeah. A disciple of the Buddha shares life, does not misuse sexuality. A disciple of the Buddha is truthful and does not lie. A disciple of the Buddha remains clear, does not intoxicate self or others, at least to any great extent. A disciple of the Buddha speaks kindly, does not speak ill of others. A disciple of the Buddha is modest, does not praise oneself at the expense of others. A disciple of the Buddha is generous, not possessive of anything. A disciple of the Buddha is loving, does not harbor ill will. And finally, tonight's the last one. A disciple of the Buddha cherishes and polishes the three treasures. There's nothing there about disparaging. What this tells me is really honoring just the precious nature of these three jewels. That's really the point. And so if we look at these, here's the question that arose for me around this precept. There are times where we may not like a community that we've gone to practice with. We may feel as if the teacher says something that triggers us, yeah? Or someone in the community, or an attitude in the community. And so it can be hard not to then go back into our lives and tell people, I did not like that teacher. He was kind of rude, kind of coarse, didn't resonate with that teacher. He didn't seem to really care about the people in there. This is something I once said about a teacher. And so having done that many years ago, now I look back and go, okay, I was my partner at the time, so I felt like it was okay to express that. Or there may be a teaching that really challenges us. It may be that there is a particular preliminary that can feel very judgmental, especially around the hell realms and building unwholesome karma. So there's a whole cosmology in some of these Buddhist traditions where wholesome fear is basically engendered in a person. The fear that makes you want to do better. Yeah. So that may not sit well with some of us. So I think, though, that sort of an evaluative quality is one thing. But what the Buddha is really talking about in these precepts is not disparaging and not causing others to disparage. Well, why would that not be a good thing? Or why would that be a bad thing if we're going to sort of look at this in pure duality? But maybe we can answer it by going right through the middle path. What is the role of a bodhisattva here? What does the bodhisattva care about? Mitigating suffering, right? The bodhisattva doesn't want to steal someone else's faith or confidence in a path that perhaps is consuming their entire way of being in the world. So, giving you an example, when I was a chaplain at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, I met a woman who was an evangelical Christian, and when she found out I was a Buddhist, she said, well, of course you know you're going to hell. And immediately I felt my wall go up. I felt my own sort of triggering, yeah? And I shut down. Big oops moment as a chaplain, because that's not what I'm there to do. But my defenses kicked in. And but I was able to see through that reaction to the fact that she wasn't trying to cut me down, or she wasn't doing this out of anger, but she was saying it out of concern. And when I could at least hear that part, and I was able to kind of course correct in that moment. It didn't take that long. And so what I said to her was, it's pretty frightening to think that there would be people who might not embrace Christ and then be sort of cast into the fires of hell. Yeah, this matters to you very much. And I said it very sincerely, and she said, yeah. Well, we continued to have about 2.5 years of a really, really wonderful chaplain cancer patient relationship. And that may not have happened had I just shut down and said, I think I need to get the Protestant chaplain to visit her and such, but I wasn't content with that. I cared that she was suffering in that moment, regardless of what she was saying to me. And I think that this is part of the link I'm drawing here with this precept is the last thing I would have ever done was take her faith and her trust and her belief away from her. Right? She needed it. After all, she had a rare form of blood cancer called multiple myeloma, and she really needed to hold on to that very much. So why on earth would I try to correct anything? It wasn't about that at all. So I was showing up specifically to be of benefit. And if I couldn't do that any longer, then I would have needed to have gone somewhere else. So I think this is the spirit of this precept, is be mindful that what we say in a community, or I'll put it to myself, as Tajay was so good about doing this morning, it'll be this, I'll just relate this to me, that if I'm having an issue or I'm having a problem with something, whether it's the Buddha himself, the teachings, or the community, that I don't want to sort of pull the rug out from under someone else in this community that is being nourished by it. So then what? Now, what if we feel like there is real injustice happening, right? Or even worse, abuse? That turns this whole precept around, doesn't it? For those of us who are mindful. And so here's the thing that I was sort of thinking about earlier. There are two qualities at play here that need to be balanced, and one is accountability. That the three jewels are accountable. The Buddha is accountable to his realizations, to being an enlightened one, quote unquote, which is the meaning of Buddha. The teachings are accountable so that our best interests are really considered and held, and that skillful means are applied on the path. So often the second of the three refuges is Dharma, which can also mean the path of realization. So the Buddha is the first, the great teacher, the great physician, as he's sometimes called, the enlightened one. The second, the Dharma, is certainly his teachings, but really that reflects the entirety of the Buddhist path. And then the last is the community. The community itself is also accountable, so that if there is something that is generating suffering, or there is abuse happening, as the Dalai Lama himself has said, if a teacher gets involved in misconduct, if a community is denying reality, then that community or that teacher is wrong, and they should not be followed. Now, is that disparaging Sangha, Dharma, Buddha? Or is it holding these sacred jewels accountable? Many people would say they don't need to be held accountable. They simply are, by their very nature, wholesome. Otherwise, they wouldn't be jewels. And yet those expressions, the manifestations in this world of those three jewels aren't always so wholesome. And so the accountability has to be with each of these three jewels, not in necessarily their actuality, but in how we perceive them. Because the Buddha or rather the Sangha that is, let's say, abusive or steeped in ignorance is not the Dharma Sangha. The true Dharma is not something that is meant or can hurt us if skillful means are being applied. Yeah. So, and the Buddha himself, trying to account for the creation of suffering in the community, this is why these 10 great precepts exist in the first place. Now these, as many of us know, these didn't come into being until the 12th year of his teaching in the community. So these were not things he immediately did, but they were all sort of generated out of real situations that happened in the Sangha. And so in a way, it was kind of a trial by fire, if you will, yeah? The monks are bickering and they're blaming each other for their problems, yeah? We need to sort of have some code here where we don't do this, but we resolve things differently. So, so accountability, that's the first one. The second one has to do with ignorance and accurate perception. So you can pick either one of those words. And it's one thing to have doubt in these things, or to have doubt in a teaching. This is one of the hindrances. This is not considered a parajika offense, which is the parajika is it's an ethical offense. And if it's bad enough, there are grounds for expulsion from the community. Now remember, we're talking a monastic community. We're talking monks and nuns living in community. So they're around each other all the time. So understanding that we may not know everything. And believe me, as somebody who used to be very self-assured about, I know, when I was younger, I know this, I know that, as many of us are when we're younger. I had to crack that egoic nut, if you will, to be open to other views, to be open to cultivating means discomfort. Now, it's hard to get anywhere with our practice if we're not willing to have a little discomfort. That is not the same thing as being triggered or being unsafe. And so the accuracy of understanding the teachings, or of understanding who was the Buddha and his teachings, or the community, we want to really put our vow into not following any of these things blindly, but understanding them for ourselves. And this is what the Buddha taught. Don't take the word of your teachers for it. Don't take the word of your spiritual companions, your Kalyana Mitra. That's Kalyana Mitra is a term for spiritual companion in the community. Don't even take my word for it, but see what's true for you. This was one of the Buddha's central teachings. Understanding for yourself. That may not agree with kind of the way the teachings are put forth. I have things in texts and such that I definitely do not agree with the translations or with even the context, some of the cultural contexts of Buddhism, which kind of don't make sense in some ways for Dharma applied to modernity, to our modern lives as lay people. So, but there is a way of understanding things where our awareness can mine the beautiful ore of the teachings and refine them into gold, so that our own faith and our own understanding really begins to work for us in our lives. And with meditation practice, that's the idea. It's not just views, but it's what realizations arise on the cushion. The other thing that's often understood about this is that the Dharma, the jewel of Dharma, of the path or the teachings, should always be that which informs the Sangha. That the community, if it veers from living the teachings, needs to kind of veer back a bit. And those teachings arise from the Buddha. And this whole circle comes to fruition when we become, first we embody the Dharma teachings, we then embody the Sangha. The Sangha lives in us. And then through further cultivation, when we are enlightened, when we are free, we become the jewel of the Buddha too. This is at least the idea. So coming back to this word disparaging, now that we have kind of looked in at why these are so precious, somebody who goes around and starts, or if we feel inclined to just start criticizing and bad-mouthing any of these jewels and causing others to do it, is really seen to be an offense in the Buddhist tradition, in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. And this includes lay people. It builds bad merit and so on. And in the same way that we've talked about in recent weeks about skillful means to address things. It doesn't mean this Sangha I have to stay in, or I am bound to this teacher. It's okay to change communities, but these are things that we want to hold dear and take very seriously, because what else do we have? Who else will support us in our Dharma practice or in whatever practice we're in? We need a family of practitioners who really deeply care about each other, support each other, and for whom it's not about me in this moment, but I recognize that my brother, my sister, my binary person, sibling is struggling, and I need to be here for them. And so in the Buddha's time, and in his teachings in the Vinaya and the Pali Canon, take care of each other, because this is your spiritual family. Yeah. So anyway, disparaging it, according to the precepts, not a good idea, because it's like anger or resentment. It's like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. We're sort of cutting ourselves off from something that is ideally a true refuge, as opposed to a false refuge. And if it becomes a false refuge because there are things happening we don't agree with, it doesn't mean that we are cutting off the entirety of the Buddha Dharma or the entirety of the global Sangha, because there are many, many, many Dharma communities. Yeah. And there have been numerous people I personally have known, a few of them are monastics, who have been abused in their Dharma communities by a senior teacher or by a monk when they were younger. Physically abused, sexually abused, brought into a relationship, lived with the teacher. Now, often these are insular communities that are either living out in remote retreat centers and such. Yeah. And the victim blaming, I mean, it can get very, very messy. This is a truth. Buddhism is not exempt from these things either. And so when I've heard these things, there has been work to do to help people reclaim the things that were important to them with meditation, with practice, because these were folks who were willing to just go, forget all of this. It is all hypocrisy. But you know what? Your practice, you owned it. Your wisdom, your realizations were true. Don't just dispel all of what you have learned. That part belonged to you. Let's see how else that can be nurtured and grown. How can that soil of your garden be enriched differently in a different place with a different group, a different teacher? So disparaging the jewels outright. Part of this is also, there's a Lojong slogan in the 7-point mind training: drive all blames into one. Or even more so, no blame. What this is doing is it's saying, let's unravel all of the projections and kind of recognize that if I'm reacting, if I'm triggered, that may be something due to my experience, regardless of whether or not it was someone actually doing harm, and that is the case sometimes. But rather than getting steeped in that and saying it is all of the Buddha's fault, it is all of the fault of the Dharma and all Sanghas and Buddhists everywhere, that is a tragedy in the eyes of these traditions.